I'm blanking on that. I'll talk about that in a hangout. So then, presidential system, semi-presidential system. Presidential system, you have Mexico and Nigeria. Semi-presidential, you have France and Russia. The executive titles for Mexico and Nigeria are AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, and then Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari. Their powers, assenting to political bills, can send a bill back to the National Assembly, can have the Supreme Court review it for constitutionality of law. In Nigeria, Mexico, head of the state, government, and armed forces. Now, the legitimacy of the Nigerian military in terms of effectively keeping that state stable is always kind of a tricky topic. It's slowly getting better, but you got to remember from 1957 on, they had something like 22 coups d'etats, and the current president, Muhammadu Buhari, was one of those people that led a coup d'etat in the late 70s and exiled a couple of other guys who then came back later and became president. So it's a pretty wild system. All right, term limits, sexennial in Mexico, Nigeria, 4 years, renewable once. Only one president has lasted for those two terms in the Nigerian system, and that's Olusegun Obasanjo currently. The cabinet powers in Nigeria, they have 19 secretaries of state. That's basically their cabinet. Federal Executive Legal Office, they do not play a role in legislative or executive actions or governance. They're purely an advisory board. And that's pretty much the same for the Mexican state. AMLO is constantly dealing with his cabinet members, either disobeying them or not really agreeing with them. There's just nothing he can really do. He has to keep going. All right, so Russia, semi-presidential system, powers, okay? The president, he's the head of state, government, commander-in-chief of the military. If they are deemed unfit to complete their presidential duties, a president becomes prime minister and prime minister becomes president. So it would switch. Now, the only thing is, in 1999, when this happened to Putin, Yeltsin resigned. He wasn't deemed unfit. He didn't deem himself unfit. He just decided, I'm done with this, and he resigned amid social pressures and political pressures. But he wasn't deemed unfit. So this isn't what happened with Putin. It was the fact that Putin was Yeltsin's prime minister, and then Yeltsin resigned, and then Putin was like, I have both of these jobs now. And that's what it's been since 1999, because the United Russian Party gets Putin elected in 2000, and he's been in power since, removing term limits most recently in this January. Third highest political office is the chairman of the Federation Council. That's our Speaker of the House, like big whoop. So their presidential duties, federal law, responsibility of appointing ministers, diplomatic and regulatory judicial officials, pardons, cool. March 2018, Putin started his most recent term, and he's going to be in office for the rest of our lives. The ability to dissolve the Duma rests on the hands of the president. Now, this was attempted once. Yeltsin was attempting this in 1993. The Duma is the lower house of the legislative branch in the Russian state. They did not like Yeltsin, so they were trying to impeach him and put in his vice president as the ruler. Yeltsin hated that idea, so he was impeached. He had the military storm the state house, and then 187 people will end up dying, 437 wounded, and Yeltsin will maintain power until 1999. Remember, he was a BFF with Bill Clinton. So the current prime minister as of January 2020 is Mikhail Mishustin. He is the head of government, administrative role. It's no term limits as long as he's in charge, depending upon Putin's will, realistically, then he'll be there. The legislative houses, the Duma and the Federation Council. Duma, consent to the prime minister. I'm going to speed up a little bit. Issue of confidence in the government. Head of state. Here's the State of the Union. Appoint and dismiss cabinet members. You guys can read this. This one's really simple. All right. The Duma is a very large house, 450 members. 225 are directly elected. The second half is proportionally elected. Now, the only thing about that is your party has to be represented throughout the entire state of Russia. It can't be one individual state of Russia. That's what it was prior to the election of 1993. When it was prior to 93, the political parties were solely based off of charismatic legitimacy. So there were parties called like the military bloc of General Antonov. Like very specific, very charismatically led, and really no political base at all outside of their one little hometown. So that changes in 93, and it really changes in 1999 when Putin puts it to a ton of new laws, and that shrinks the political parties from like 47 down to 6. Um, Federation Council, what they can do, approval of the change of borders in the Russian subjects. So that's key because when you think about Crimea and the upcoming probably reintegration of Belarus into the Russian state, that's the Federation Council that decides on that. And they took Crimea under ethnic traditionalism, that ethnically Crimea is predominantly Russian, Ossetian Russian, and not Polish or Ukrainian. Sorry, Shimashevsky is going to kill me for that. So Federation Council, approval of presidential decree, martial law, state of emergency. Currently, they're in a state of emergency right now with coronavirus. Decides the use of armed forces outside the Russian state. Very simple. If they're going to invade Belarus or invade Poland or invade Ukraine. Currently, they're slowly invading on the east border of Ukraine under the guise that it's not the Russian military. They'll announce the presidency, the impeachment of the presidency, yada, yada, yada. Very simple stuff. Social cleavages. They're traditional authoritarian legitimacy. They've had a singular ruler for their entire existence. And Putin just fits that cult of personality. He's really built himself up as this massive machismo, this very manly authoritarian, ruler of the people, quote unquote. And the people just believe in it and go with it. There's a lot of rural versus urban cleavages. The majority of the Russian populace lives in urban cities. The minority are just spread out over the entire vast landmass that is Russia. So that brings up the Slavophile versus Westerner. Westerner is typically more urban. Slavophile, Slavic, are typically more rural. This state is slowly built off of communism and Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto that Lenin got, read, liked, and then created his own type of system. Lenin was snuck back into the Russian state by the Germans during World War One to try to get the Russian military to stop fighting on the Eastern Front so Germany could face its military in other areas. By the time Lenin gets in, the Russian military is already slowly revolting, and then he leads the Bolshevik Revolution, and then you start to see a massive political overthrow. The movie Anastasia. I'm blanking on the Romanov family gets slaughtered in the middle of the night, and then 30 Russian women since that time have all claimed that they're the Princess Anastasia. So Lenin comes in and he claims that he's the vanguard of the proletariat. That means the protectorate of the people. The proletariat being the people, vanguard, protectorate, saying that he's going to make sure he takes care of you guys from that point forward. And he begins with this democratic centralism, really bringing all the power in. All directing bodies must be elected. They must keep the electorate up to place, but you're following the Soviet Party. You're not coming out with any other type of ideologies. You're a Soviet state and you're dealing with that. And then that also came into play with co-optation and nomenclature. Co-optation is the allocation of power through various means, social, political, and economic institutions. So if you're my friend, you have money, you want this amazing political government job, you give me a little bit of money to either the state or realistically my corrupt bank account, and I give you the governor of this town or head of this specific agency. Nomenclature means a personal connection in the USSR. So these two work hand in hand, co-optation and nomenclature. Stalin. All right, I'm going to go through these really quickly, and then we'll end on Putin. Then I'll make a new one about China. So Stalin, powers. He is basically all powerful. Like there's almost nothing you can do that he would be ever in trouble of. Like, oh, I broke a law. I had no idea. He's written the laws that allow him to abuse the laws. So it's actually like 3D chess. Tons of charismatic legitimacy. I talked about the cult of personality that he's built. He's released pictures of him doing judo. He's released pictures of him like shirtless on horses. Remember, this guy used to work for the KGB. He's like a triple degree black belt in judo. Like, ridiculous. His daughter's wedding cost over $1 million. They rented out a whole ski resort. So he has this massive support among the people. powers expanded through World War II. Oh, no, I'm talking about Stalin. Oh, yeah. So when Stalin takes over, and it's actually after Lenin, and Lenin writes that secret letter that Khrushchev talks about. But Stalin takes over, and his charismatic legitimacy is built solely on the fact that he has to defeat Adolf Hitler, and he makes the entire workforce and the entire populace of Russia defeat Adolf Hitler. The World War II was won by Russian blood, American money, and or British money and American steel. You know, it's a very American nationalistic exceptionalism to say that we won World War One, because when we finally start fighting the war, June 6th of 1944 in the European front, or if you go back even further, 1942 in the African peninsula or African continent, like, we take a lot of credit for fighting the second stringers of the Nazi regime. Not to say that that's not to discredit our efforts during World War II, but the Russians faced almost 70% of the German Wehrmacht. So Stalin basically came out of that as a king. He implements these 5-year policies. One is collectivization, so he's putting people in collective communes, making them all live together. Not as drastically as Mao. Mao will end up going on to kill low estimate 14 million, high estimate 60 with his specific collectivization policies and that cultural leap forward. But it's very similar. The industrialization, Stalin basically prepared them for war from 1939 and just kept them at war until the Soviet Union falls in 1988, 1989. He'll end up dying in 1953. Towards the end, people believe he had dementia because he just starts killing people. Anybody. The start of the World War II, they did so poorly because Stalin killed almost 10,000 of his officers. Anyone that was deemed unfit or un-Soviet enough, he killed. So then that led into Khrushchev. Khrushchev's a little weird because on one hand he's progressive, on the other hand he's hardcore Soviet. So he puts in this de-Stalinization of the USSR. He allows for some type of freedom of expression. That's the child youth movement. But then he also gives nuclear bombs to Cuba. Doesn't make any sense. He pulls out the secret letter from Lenin, and a lot of Russians at the time still view Lenin as the father of the Soviet Union, the father of modern day Russia. And the secret letter was criticizing Stalin, saying he's going to be a psychopath. You got to be careful. Like, you can't let this happen. So that gave Khrushchev a ton of legitimacy to the Russian state. Then you have Brezhnev. Brezhnev went back and made it more Soviet. So he practiced a couple of different things. One was nuclear parity with the United States. He made sure for every nuke we had, they had one. He also was extremely strict over the economy. There's something called the Brezhnev stagnation, that because Khrushchev had some type of economic reforms, the economy was actually getting a little bit better, even though they were spending 90% of their money on military arms. Not really 90, but close. But Brezhnev ups that, whatever the military spending was, and he causes this thing called the Brezhnev stagnation, which is a slowing of the economy, which basically led Gorbachev down a never-ending road of, like, the Soviet Union's failing, and it's all going to be blamed on you. He invades the Middle East, specifically Afghanistan. That happens a little bit with Gorbachev as well, and that's where the United States really has that quasi-Cold War. We start funding the Taliban. The Taliban, led by a senator named Charlie Wilson, are starting to receive governmental grants from $1 million all the way up to about $500 million by the end of it, to close to $1 billion. And their sole purpose was fighting the Russian military. So where U.S.-backed Taliban forces were fighting the Russian military. So that happened during the 80s, and that's the height, the peak of the Cold War. 63 with the Cuban Missile Crisis is like one peak. The last peak that really drives it home is the Afghanistan intervention. Gorbachev, three-prong attack. You have Glasnost, democratization, and perestroika. Glasnost is openness. For the first time, you can criticize the government. You can criticize people. You can have freedom of speech. Democratization. Let's have freedom of voting. Let's have real voting. And then perestroika. It's a allowance to be critical, and it's an openness for reform. So Glasnost and perestroika are very, very similar. And basically, that allowed for some type of fall of the USSR. And then you have the famous Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, Berlin Wall moment, and you have the fall of the Berlin Wall.